Iqbal Latif. Why has Saudi Arabia just slashed its oil price to Asia by $11 a barrel, the deepest single cut in a generation? They want a headline. I will give them a ladder instead, because you cannot understand one price cut without climbing, rung by rung from its origin to its consequence. Each rung supports the next. Miss one and the whole structure collapses into confusion. Climb them in order and the logic becomes difficult to escape. So let us climb. Rung 1. The structure cracked OPEC was never a company. It was an architecture of discipline built upon a single load-bearing pillar. Saudi Arabia as the world's swing producer, the one country capable of opening or closing the tap to stabilize prices. That architecture has begun to crack. On the 1st of May, 2026, the United Arab Emirates walked out of OPEC after nearly 6 decades of membership. It was not an emotional decision. It was arithmetic. Abu Dhabi had invested roughly $150 billion expanding production capacity toward 5 million barrels a day, yet the quota system allowed it to produce only a fraction of that potential. The UAE built the engine and was then told it could not press the accelerator. Ask yourself the same question, Abu Dhabi asked. Why invest to produce oil you are forbidden to sell? When a producer possessing genuine spare capacity, the rarest asset in the oil business, concludes that membership costs more than it delivers, it reveals that the old architecture was already under severe strain. The departure did not merely weaken OPEC, it exposed how fragile the old model had already become. Rung 2. The swing producer. Reaches for the oldest weapon now stand in Riyadh's shoes. Saudi Arabia possesses something almost no other country has, the ability to produce roughly 12 million barrels of oil a day. That is not a statistic. It is a weapon. It means Saudi Arabia can, if it chooses, flood the market and drive prices toward $40 a barrel. For years, that weapon remained holstered because discipline served everyone's interests. But discipline works only when everyone sacrifices together. Once the UAE chose to pursue its own production strategy, free to pump 5 million barrels instead of 3, Saudi Arabia faced a different calculation. Why should Riyadh continue sacrificing revenue and market share so that someone outside the agreement can freely sell every additional barrel? So Saudi Arabia reached for the oldest weapon in its arsenal: price. This is why the recent cut is not simply a commercial discount, it is a strategic declaration. It tells competitors, in the only language commodity markets truly understand, if you wish to compete on volume, then let us discover together what those extra barrels are worth in a market with abundant supply. The signal is unmistakable to anyone who reads the fine print. Aramco is now selling its flagship Arab Light grade to Asia at a discount to the regional benchmark, something it has done only twice before, during the price wars of 2015 and 2020. The $11 cut itself is the largest single reduction in decades. However you measure it, the message is the same. History has seen this before. In 1986, Saudi Arabia abandoned production restraint and allowed prices to collapse in order to discipline higher-cost producers. The expensive barrels disappeared first, and Saudi market share recovered. Today's circumstances are different. The underlying logic is remarkably similar. Rung 3. Oil is cruelly elastic. Here is the rung many commentators never climb. Oil is extraordinarily elastic at the margin. You do not need a flood to move prices. An extra million barrels a day can create enormous downward pressure. A missing million barrels can create enormous upward pressure. The market does not price the average barrel. It prices the last barrel. That final marginal barrel determines the balance between shortage and surplus, and it moves prices with astonishing force. Now consider what is arriving simultaneously. Additional production from the UAE, Iran gradually restoring exports as regional conditions improve and the blockade lifts, and doing so at better prices than the deep discounts it was forced to accept during the war. Venezuela attempting to recover production. American shale producers standing ready whenever prices climb high enough to justify new drilling. Above roughly $70 to $80 a barrel, shale increasingly becomes economic once again, placing a practical ceiling on sustained price rallies. Each source alone matters. Together, they matter far more. Every additional marginal barrel compounds the pressure created by the previous one. The International Energy Agency already projects a surplus approaching 4 million barrels a day. This is why even relatively modest increases in global supply can produce disproportionately large movements in price. Rung 4. The efficiency nobody talks about now. We arrive at the structural change hiding in plain sight. Look at what the United States produces with every barrel of oil today compared with 15 years ago. Around 2011, the American economy generated roughly $15 trillion of output. Today it is approaching $30 trillion. Oil consumption has risen only modestly over the same period, from about 18.9 million barrels a day in 2011 to roughly 20.6 million now. Consumption up a sliver. Output nearly doubled. That is not a rounding error. It is a civilizational efficiency gain. Software, services, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, digital finance. The wider knowledge economy now generates vastly more economic value from every barrel consumed than heavy industry ever could. Prosperity is becoming progressively less dependent upon petroleum. The decoupling is real. At the same time, solar power continues expanding worldwide. Electric vehicles continue reducing future oil demand, while battery technology improves every year. The demand curve is no longer rising as automatically as it once did. Meanwhile, production capacity continues expanding. Supply rises. Demand grows more slowly. Put those two structural forces together, and you do not merely get another oil cycle. You begin to see an entirely different pricing regime. Rung 5. Against the profits of scarcity, I trust this ladder because I have climbed it before. 20 years ago, conventional wisdom insisted that the world was running out of oil. Peak oil dominated conferences. Investment banks projected prices climbing relentlessly towards $200 a barrel. The assumption was simple: scarcity. Reality chose abundance instead. The world continued discovering reserves. We hold on the order of 1.8 trillion barrels of discovered reserves today. Since 2006, we have consumed well over 1 trillion barrels, and we still hold roughly the same, with more found every year. Technology unlocked resources once considered unreachable. Shale transformed North America. Efficiency reduced demand growth. Renewables entered the energy mix faster than almost anyone expected. The scarcity profits were not simply early. They misunderstood the direction of travel. Oil did not become scarce. It became increasingly abundant precisely as economies became less dependent upon it. Every time predictions of permanently high prices return, remember one simple mechanism. Above $70 to $80, shale production becomes increasingly attractive. New supply appears. Prices come back down. That ceiling is not ideological. It is mechanical. The profits of $200 oil belong to the same family as the profits of empty wells. Both mistook a moment for a destiny. Rung 6. The Great Transfer. Now we reach the rung where geopolitics becomes household economics. Every sustained $10 fall in the oil price transfers roughly $400 billion annually from producers to consumers. The arithmetic is straightforward. The world consumes roughly 105 million barrels every day, nearly 38 billion barrels every year. Move the average price by $10. You move almost $400 billion across the global economy. Few mechanisms redistribute wealth on that scale. The beneficiaries are overwhelmingly the importing nations, especially those whose economies remain heavily dependent upon imported energy. The recent conflict inflicted immense human and economic damage. Yet the reopening of supply routes, secured by a ceasefire in which Pakistan served as the indispensable mediator, has also increased available supply. Paradoxically, peace may prove far more disruptive to prices than war. The poorest consumers of Asia may ultimately emerge as some of the greatest beneficiaries: India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, much of the developing world. The exporters may sell more barrels, but they may earn considerably less from each one. Rung 7. Pakistan, and what it must do with its winnings. Here, the latter becomes personal. Pakistan consumes roughly 450,000 barrels of oil each day, about 165 million barrels a year, and imports more than 80% of what it burns. That dependence makes every movement in global oil prices extraordinarily important. A $10 drop in crude is worth on the order of $1.5 to $1.5 billion a year. A collapse from today's levels toward $40 is worth something closer to $10 billion a year. For an economy that constantly struggles for foreign exchange, cheaper energy is not merely welcome. It is oxygen, but a windfall wasted is worse than a windfall never received. Cheap oil that simply finances additional consumption disappears. Cheap oil invested in structural reform compounds for decades. Pakistan, therefore, has a narrow window of opportunity. Lower energy costs should be passed through to industry so manufacturers become genuinely competitive. The country should accelerate investment in solar energy because every additional megawatt permanently reduces future import dependence. It should undertake a forensic review of independent power producer contracts. If global fuel costs fall dramatically while legacy payment structures remain unchanged, much of the oil dividend will simply disappear into outdated contractual obligations. That correction must happen before the price collapse fully lands, because once it does, the gap between what the market charges and what those contracts extract becomes a fiscal wound. Those distortions should be corrected while the opportunity exists. Finally, lower imported inflation creates room for lower domestic interest rates. Combined with broader financial reform and greater mobilization of domestic savings, cheaper energy can become the foundation of stronger long-term investment rather than temporary relief. The view from the top. We began with a ladder because markets are rarely explained by headlines. They are explained by structure. One rung supports the next until the destination becomes obvious. Saudi Arabia did not simply cut an oil price. It acknowledged that the old architecture of producer discipline is under growing strain. The market has entered a phase in which spare capacity, technology, efficiency, and geopolitics increasingly matter more than cartel discipline alone. The arithmetic is indifferent to politics. The last barrel still sets the price. The poorest consumers may become the greatest beneficiaries. Whether countries like Pakistan transform that opportunity into lasting prosperity will depend not upon oil itself, but upon the quality of their policies. The ladder is built. Every rung is visible. The climb is now a matter of choice.